Hey, what's up everyone? So I ran across an article that talked about how TherapySpeak is being overused. So let's dive into talking about using TherapySpeak and language around mental health and whether that helps awareness and how that serves or disserves the mental health population. Let's dive into it. So first, let's talk about the use of the word anxiety. This is so common right now, and really a significant portion of the population does struggle with anxiety. But are we overusing the word? Even in common language, people talk about being anxious all the time. And what happens is that we kind of dilute the meaning of the word because we're using it in so many contexts when clinically it doesn't actually fit. And I get that anxious was an adjective way before it was written into the DSM-5. But now we have so many other words that we can use to describe how we're feeling about something. Diluting the clinical meaning of anxiety really does a disservice to the people who struggle with clinical anxiety. And so when we're talking about clinical anxiety, we're actually talking about intrusive thoughts, thoughts that are hard to control, have a significant impact on somebody's life, and actually results in physical distress. So those three pieces need to be there for something like generalized anxiety disorder, and it has to persist for 6 months. And that's where I think we cheapen the language a lot when somebody is anxious about a test or anxious about their schoolwork. If that anxiety goes away after a stressor is taken away, it may not be an anxiety disorder. And as we have this discussion, that's probably the most important thing to think about disorders, is that they persist. They're not just a one-off feeling or in response to a specific stressor that when taken away, that feeling goes away. And it does make it hard to sort through for people who might struggle with a significant disorder for other people to be talking about the same thing and throwing that word around like it's nothing. So here's a big one and probably the trickiest one to talk about: trauma. Trauma has been a buzzword for a couple of years now, and there was a significant move by the mental health community to normalize the experience of trauma, how that affects people. We talk about trauma-informed care, being able to look at how people's behaviors, beliefs, and coping are affected by trauma in their past. Here's what's happened though, I think, as trauma has become normalized, is that the word has become cheapened as everyone talks about some negative event in their childhood and their upbringing as traumatic. And here's where it gets tricky. Generally, trauma is not defined by the severity of the event, but by the impact that it has on somebody. And so what that means is, in the DSM, trauma is actually defined as a near-death experience or exposure to violence or danger. But not all near-death experiences are necessarily traumatic. What follows is that we also talk about the criteria for diagnosing somebody with PTSD, and that they have to be re-experiencing that event in some way. They have to be avoiding triggers or memories associated with that event. There have to be certain negative thoughts and feelings associated with themselves or with that event. And there have to be different symptoms of hyperarousal or reactivity associated with that event. If all of those criteria are not met, we might consider that an aversive experience, a negative experience, but that doesn't quite fit the bill for trauma. And where this really does a disservice for the mental health community and people who are struggling with trauma and clinically diagnosed traumatic disorders, we talk about some teacher giving us a bad grade or being yelled at once or twice as traumatic experiences. And while there are experiences that shape our behaviors and shape how we think about ourselves, those are not necessarily traumatic, and that cheapens the term, and it really makes it difficult for there to be a standard of care around trauma when suddenly everything is trauma. And so how do we strike a balance? We talk about anxiety and trauma as very common buzzwords right now that maybe are overused in the way that they're just a catch-all for something negative. For mental health professionals, we can definitely be educating people, be talking about why we are giving somebody a particular diagnosis, talking about diagnosing and educating clients on what this means and how that impacts their lives. What we can do is be more specific about our language and our words. In English, we have so many different descriptive words to talk about feelings, emotions. There are so many flavors of language, And we don't have to be limited to these buzzwords. We can talk about feeling jittery, feeling butterflies in our stomach, feeling low motivation, low energy. We can talk about feeling keyed up, restless, what we're telling ourselves, or what that feeling is in our body or in our hearts and in our minds. Those are so many different ways we can use the richness of our language to talk about what's going on internally without cheapening the clinical terms that are becoming more common. And I do want to acknowledge that that's a great thing, that we can talk about mental health more publicly and more openly. What I want to avoid is a pendulum swinging too far and suddenly those terms don't mean anything because they're overused and they become junk words that are just catch-all. So thank you all for tuning into this video, really appreciate it. Would appreciate your likes and subscribes, as that helps the channel to keep growing. Thank you for engaging with this idea. It's really tough to talk about mental health in the first place. Let's be smart about how we use that language that we have. Again, thank you all for checking out this video. See you next time.